What if Europe's relationship with the U.S. is actually holding it back?
Je pense qu'il faut déléguer notre géopolitique aux États-Unis d'Amérique.
I love Europe. I love the countries of Europe.
Il faut déléguer notre innovation technologique aux hyperscalers américains.
EU treats us very, very unfairly, very badly.
Escalating trade wars, policy clashes, and Washington's relentless meddling in European affairs.
Mr. Trump, off.
The price of loyalty to the U.S. is becoming
Under Donald
unbearable.
Trump's leadership, we may disagree with your views.
And with the latest Trump administration, things are only getting worse.
President-elect Donald Trump is threatening the European Union with tariffs if member countries don't buy more American oil.
Trump has said he wants the U.S. to take control of Canada, Greenland, and the Panama Canal.
The U.S. has always put its own interests first, forcing Europe to shoulder the consequences, economically, politically, and strategically. But what if staying tied to the U.S. isn't just costly, but a direct threat to Europe's future? By the end of this video, you'll see why breaking free isn't just an option. It's Europe's only path to true strength, resilience, and independence. One of the most compelling arguments for European economic independence lies in the fallout from recurrent trade conflicts with the U.S., which have exposed the vulnerabilities of over-reliance on American markets. During the Trump administration in 2018, there were 25% tariffs on European steel and 10% tariffs on aluminum under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. These tariffs cost EU exporters an estimated $7.7 billion annually, with Germany, France, and Italy bearing the loss. Rather than capitulating, the EU responded with retaliatory tariffs targeting $3.3 billion worth of U.S. goods, including bourbon, motorcycles, and agricultural products, disproportionately affecting politically sensitive sectors. While you might think that this was disruptive, this confrontation allowed the EU to accelerate its trade diversification. By 2023, the EU had finalized major trade agreements with Japan, Mercosur, and ASEAN nations, allowing them to reduce the share of U.S. trade in the EU's external commerce from 18% in 2016 to 14% in 2022. Here's another example. In 2004, there was the Boeing-Airbus subsidy dispute, in which the two aerospace giants were accused of benefiting from illegal subsidies. The U.S. argued that Airbus has benefited from illegal subsidies in the form of launch aid and other financial assistance from European governments. The EU countered that Boeing received significant support through military contracts, research grants, and tax breaks. The USA and EU filed complaints with the World Trade Organization, which later ruled that the US and EU provided illegal subsidies to their aerospace giants. In response to this ruling, the US imposed $7.5 billion in tariffs on EU goods in 2019, while the EU retaliated with $4 billion. Rather than crippling Airbus, the dispute galvanized EU member states to increase public investment in aerospace innovation. By 2021, Airbus had surpassed Boeing in annual deliveries for the fourth consecutive year, capturing 62% of the global market for large commercial aircraft. Meanwhile, the EU's Global Gateway Initiative, a €300 billion infrastructure investment plan launched in 2021, aims to counter US and Chinese influence by financing sustainable projects in developing nations, a clear signal of Europe's intent to carve out an independent economic role. Moreover, the EU's focus on Africa through the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, has opened new avenues for investment. For instance, the EU's €150 billion Africa-Europe investment package, launched in 2022, prioritizes renewable energy projects such as the Desertec initiative, which aims to harness solar power from the Sahara to meet 15% of Europe's electricity demand by 2050. These initiatives not only diversify Europe's trade portfolio, but also position it as a leader in sustainable development, contrasting sharply with the US's transactional approach to foreign policy. This was a need of the hour considering Trump's reappointment as president, which is already showing signs that he'll bring up tariffs in exchange for some unmet demands.
President-elect Donald Trump is threatening the European Union with tariffs if member countries don't buy more American oil and gas. In a Truth Social post, Trump saying if the EU does not make up its deficit with the United States, quote, it's tariffs all the way.
His proposed 10% universal tariff would cost EU exporters 85 billion euros each year, with the German car industry being hit the hardest, with over 20 billion euros in tariffs on Mercedes, BMW, and Volkswagen. Trump has also promised to reinstate steel and aluminum tariffs after March 2025 and renew threats of 25% auto tariffs, a worst-case scenario for Germany where 14% of jobs depend on auto manufacturing.
In particular, in the very near future, we're going to be placing tariffs on foreign production of computer chips, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals to return production of these essential goods to the United States of America.
Robert Lighthizer, Trump's former USTR, who designed the 2018 tariffs, is likely to return and advocate for even harsher measures. Considering these two tariff warriors, the idea of economic independence seems like a need of the hour. And if the tariff wars aren't enough to drive the point home, then let's take a look at policy indifferences. The U.S. withdrawal from multilateral agreements and its indifference to shared global challenges have forced Europe to pursue policies that align more closely with its values and long-term interests. The 2017 U.S. exit from the Paris Climate Accord exemplified this rift. While the Biden administration rejoined the agreement in 2021, the four-year hiatus and ongoing domestic opposition to climate legislation underscored America's unreliability. For example, during the Biden administration, there was the Inflation Reduction Act, which was touted as a landmark climate policy, but it had inadvertently strained transatlantic relations. By offering $369 billion in subsidies exclusively for American-made clean energy products, the IRA drew criticism from European leaders for violating WTO rules and undermining fair competition. European automakers such as Volkswagen and BMW warned that the IRA's electric vehicle tax credits would disadvantage EU exports, potentially costing the bloc 7 billion euros in lost revenue by 2025. In response, the EU introduced the Net Zero Industry Act in 2023. Which mirrored the IRA's objectives but emphasized pan-European collaboration. The act sets a goal for net zero manufacturing capacity to meet at least 40% of the EU's annual deployment needs by 2030, providing predictability, certainty, and long-term signals to manufacturers and investors. By 2030, the act aims to create a union market for CO2 storage services. It sets a union-level goal and mandates an annual CO2 storage capacity of at least 50 million tons. This policy coherence has already borne fruit. Renewable energy accounted for nearly 40% of EU electricity generation in 2022, up from 34% in 2019, while green tech investments surged to 80 billion euros annually. Another policy indifference example is the U.S. abandonment of the Iran nuclear deal in 2018 and subsequent maximum pressure sanctions regime. The maximum pressure campaign significantly degraded EU-Iran trade. The 24-month period up to April 2021 shows that monthly EU exports to Iran averaged just 63% of the level seen in the 2 years until January 2016. In response, the EU launched the Instrument in Support of Trade Exchanges, or INSTEX, a payment mechanism designed to bypass U.S. sanctions and facilitate humanitarian trade with Iran. Though limited in scope, INSTEX demonstrated Europe's willingness to challenge U.S. extraterritorial overreach. The EU also accelerated efforts to internationalize the euro, increasing its share of global payments from 34% in 2018 to 38% in 2022, thereby reducing dependence on the US dollar. While the EU focuses on economic influence in some areas, its approach to technology regulation also sets it apart from the US. The US and EU have long been tech superpowers, but their approaches to tech regulation have diverged. The EU prioritizes market fairness and curbing monopolies, as shown by the Digital Markets Act (DMA), which targets gatekeepers like Apple, Meta, and Google with rules against self-preferencing and mandatory interoperability. However, this divergence is evident in their approaches to data privacy and AI regulation. In 2018, the EU introduced the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, requiring explicit user consent for data use and hefty fines for non-compliance. By 2021, the EU's DMA banned self-preferencing practices and mandated interoperability, while the AI Act classified AI systems by risk, banning unacceptable uses. The U.S., meanwhile, maintained a patchwork of sector-specific laws and still struggled to pass federal privacy laws, relying on state-level regulations and antitrust lawsuits. Now that the Trump administration is back, we could be looking at aggressive antitrust lawsuits, including a lawsuit to block a proposed $14 billion tech industry deal.
President-elect Trump's return to the White House is certainly sparking hopes that some deal-making.
However, without congressional backing for new laws, outcomes would depend on court rulings, which could favor corporate interests due to Trump's judicial appointments. The EU's proposed digital tax on U.S. tech companies has recently triggered retaliation from Trump, potentially escalating into yet another trade war. The U.S. campaign against Huawei's 5G infrastructure offers another example. While Washington pressured EU states to ban the Chinese firm over security concerns, the EU resisted unilateral bans, instead adopting a coordinated approach based on risk assessments. This allowed member states like Germany to leverage Huawei's cost-effective technology while developing homegrown alternatives such as OpenVPN. By 2023, European telecom giants Ericsson and Nokia had secured 22.9% and 22.7% 5G subscriber shares by radio access network vendors, demonstrating that competition, not protectionism, strengthens European industry. The EU's Digital Compass strategy further underscores its commitment to tech sovereignty. By investing €112 million in AI, quantum computing, and cybersecurity, Europe aims to capture 20% of the global semiconductor market by 2030. This ambition is bolstered by initiatives like the European Chips Act, which has already attracted €43 billion in public and private funding. It is safe to say that the EU's strict regulations, like GDPR, have made it a global leader in tech regulation, with many countries adopting similar laws. This Brussels effect forces global compliance and boosts trust in EU tech firms. However, decoupling from the US carries risks, including fragmented AI development and increased costs due to data localization mandates. But that is something the EU can cope with, once it is given that chance. On January 20, 2025, Donald Trump took the oath of office. But even before that, he had been tweeting his plans which have united the world against him. He talked about acquiring Greenland from the Kingdom of Denmark, to which he's gotten serious backlash from not just Denmark, but the EU.
Dear President Trump, listen very carefully. Greenland has been part of the Danish kingdom for 800 years. It's an integrated part of our country. It is not for sale. Let me put it in words you might understand. Mr. Trump, f*** off.
He's also expressed his demand for revising tariffs on the EU because, according to him, they treat us very badly.
They don't take our cars at all. They don't take our farm products, essentially. They don't take very much. We have a $350 billion deficit with the European Union. They treat us very, very badly. So they're going to be in for tariffs.
So, because we've been talking about tariffs and trade wars between the two, it would only make sense for us to imagine the global consequences of that. So, just for the sake of argument, let's assume that the trade wars do commence. Here's what would happen. Firstly, these implemented tariffs could trigger a 1.2% rise in EU consumer prices and a 0.8% rise in US prices. This would lead to supply chain disruptions, which could force companies like BMW to shift production, leading to job losses. And thirdly, the WTO's dispute resolution system could be crippled, encouraging other countries to impose tariffs. However, in this hypothetical trade war, the EU's €18 trillion GDP and regulatory power give it leverage. While the EU could potentially thrive independently in sectors like green tech and luxury goods, and its CBAM and regulations position it as a sustainability leader, there are still some areas where there are deep interdependencies. The EU tech giant, Advanced Semiconductor Materials Lithography, ASML, relies mostly on US components, which is why it is supported over Chinese chips. The EU also depends on US liquefied natural gas, LNG, for 40% of its post-Russia gas imports. And thirdly, the US firms supply 65% of NATO's military tech. So the situation is that the US and EU are too interconnected to decouple, but too divided to reconcile. The current tensions risk a lose-lose situation, with the global economy as collateral damage. Europe's economic trajectory since 2016 reveals a clear pattern. Confrontation with the US has not weakened the EU, but instead galvanized it to pursue greater self-reliance. By leveraging trade disputes as opportunities for diversification, resisting US policy indifference through bold climate and diplomatic initiatives, and countering interference with unified regulatory frameworks, Europe has laid the groundwork for a more resilient and innovative economy. While transatlantic cooperation remains valuable, the evidence suggests that Europe's economy is not just surviving, but thriving as it charts an independent course, one defined by sustainability, sovereignty, and strategic foresight. This expanded analysis underscores that Europe's future prosperity lies not in subordination to US interests, but in the confident assertion of its economic vision. The critical question is whether the world can afford their brinkmanship in hopes of a better Europe in the long run.